Welcome back to Let Us In Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about women.
In horror films.
In horror.
Yeah.
Just women. That's going to be the intro.
That one was quick and
Nailed
to the point. I'm Crystal, aka Creepin, it's spooky.
I'm Justine, aka JustineUFF.
I'm Emma, aka Emma of the Impact. As you can see, we have a guest who I'll have introduce herself.
Hello, friends. I am Juliet, otherwise known as FilmScum 2.0 on TikTok. I am a screenwriter, technically, but I love film in general. So,
You went to school for film, correct?
yes, I have my master's degree in screenwriting.
That's so cool. So cool. What got you into picking that master's degree?
Wait, more importantly, Juliet's just one of my favorite film TikTokers, and I'm just saying that because she's here.
That's
You just
true,
have a
though.
lot of smart opinions and funny opinions, and I am a big fan. More importantly than your whatever. What was your question?
I just want to say, by the way, I am literally obsessed with being here because I'm such a big fan of all of you guys, and it's just so nice to talk about horror in a nice space. I was actually in theater school, and I did theater in my undergrad, and I thought I was going to be a playwright, and then I didn't get accepted into playwriting school, but I did get accepted into screenwriting school. My degree is specifically in comedy screenwriting, and I trained at Second City during my master's degree.
Oh,
So
really?
yeah.
In Chicago?
That's so
Cool.
Yeah.
What was that
That
like?
is awesome.
Oh yeah, the program's really new, so I think that there's still some kinks to be worked out, but it was really cool meeting people. Second City, gotta love them. They're a load of name droppers, and let me tell you, I love a good name drop. I want to know exactly who you know, how you know them, where you've been. I want to hear it all.
It's all about connections, right? It's all about
Yeah.
connections, especially in the film industry.
Oh, for sure.
So you went into script writing, right?
Yeah, and I
Screenwriting?
just
Screenwriting.
totally fell in love with it. It was just love at first sight. I had not really been super into movies. I've loved horror since I was a kid, but not really. And then I went to grad school and I just jumped full in, totally found my passion. So
Was
Love
it
it.
a certain professor or a certain set of films that kind of just drove you into the passion of it all, or
yeah,
just
I
kinda
had
just
a
naturally?
really amazing thesis advisor. He actually wrote American Pie Bandcamp, and he's my favorite human alive.
Oh, cool.
That's super
That is so
cool.
cool. That is really cool. So what particular genre is your favorite? Is it horror?
Yeah, absolutely. Horror comedy, probably specifically. It's
Yes,
what I
they're
write.
they're so linked. Horror comedy are so linked. Tragedy and
That's my favorite.
Genres. People don't like them that much. They don't really get a lot of critical reception in the best way necessarily.
I think
Yeah,
comedy is
for
probably
sure.
the hardest to pull off, because if you don't think it's, whether it's good or bad is less relative. It's just it's either funny to you or it's not.
Exactly.
Because a lot of people, which we talk about, all of us talk about on TikTok a lot, I don't think a horror movie has to be scary to be an effective horror movie. And you talk about that a lot too, Jules.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
But with comedy, it's a little harder to watch
Yeah.
when you just don't think it's funny, right?
What is your most
Mhm.
controversial horror take?
Oh, me particularly? I hate to bring it up, but it's pretty obvious. I think that Tusk is the best A24 horror film.
Meld something so ridiculous and still be so upsetting. I fucking love it. What do
Yeah.
you love about Tusk?
I could just see Justine's face.
The movie,
I
it's
think
making
it
my
actually has-
eyeballs sweat.
I'm so sorry.
It's
I think it
okay.
actually has pretty great and ahead of its time socio-political commentary. It's about douchey podcast bros and how we media obsession with trauma and how people profit off of trauma. And he just gets his comeuppance of being a terrible person and profiting off of all this trauma, and then eventually he has that same trauma inflicted on him in the most horrific way. I will say Hereditary is a very close second.
Love that movie.
I love her.
I think that's I don't know, X and Hereditary are up there for me.
Yeah.
I really like
Yeah.
X a lot. A
We
lot.
are
In
going to
fact,
talk about women in horror. You guys know we keep it loose first.
let's get to break the ice.
Juliet, I've got a question for you. For sure.
This is a bit of a loaded question, but I'm just
boy.
trying to get a sense.
More
I'm trying to
loaded
get a
than
sense.
most.
No, I actually am just curious. What is your favorite horror movie and or your go-to favorites? You can name a few. But I know this
Yeah,
is a hard question.
I have a favorite serious horror movie and I have a favorite horror comedy, and none of them are A24. My favorite horror comedy of all time is Murder Party, which is Jeremy Saulnier, who did Green
Oh.
Room. I think he is such an intensely visceral director in the best way.
Mhm.
Like the gore in his movies is always so just like, I don't enticing. I feel like that's such a bad word for gore. It's
No.
just like
I think
so-
it's a
and
great word for gore.
It is good.
It's,
Yeah.
sometimes it's enticing to someone, sometimes it's not.
It's a satire about like art people, and I've been an artist my whole life, and I grew up around art, so it definitely like I was like, oh yeah, I could do some of that too. Then my serious one would be His House. I fell in love with it immediately as I watched it. And I just
Wow.
absolutely brilliant.
Amazing. Yeah.
Wow. I didn't expect that to be. It's a great movie. I didn't expect that to be like a favorite though. That's
Yeah.
really awesome. It's a good movie.
Yeah.
I just watched it today. We watched it for this podcast, so we'll definitely dive deep into that one shortly.
Just watched it for a second time today, and that's one you had mentioned for our topic of women in horror, and I assume it's for our main actress, but is it for our main actress or somebody involved in production? Or
In terms-
thematically?
Oh yeah, no, it's definitely Wonmi Masaku. Just absolutely kicks it out of the park with that performance. It is so haunting and heartbreaking, and
Yeah, the way she's like, "You are a liar."
I know.
Like,
it's
she's so
Yeah.
good.
Mm. Yeah, and she's holding on to culture in that film, and that character does. And she's also trying to come to terms with what has transpired to get them to where they are and what her current relationship with her husband, the person she's going through all of this with and is currently kind of stuck with, to be honest, what they're how she's going to reconcile all of that. And she does do an incredible performance. But I think that her character itself and that storyline and the themes of this film were so steeped in like trauma that women deal with, that and domestic trauma, in fact, the way that they're set to like carry on a burden or not, but what choice do they have? And then at the end, I feel like she empowered herself to make that choice and
Yeah.
love her man and stick by him and take on some of those problems that he created for all
I think-
those who said they were a child. Like,
I feel it's so complex and it's so complicated, and like he is dealing. And I think to your point, I'm literally dealing with his own stuff and just totally ignoring everything his wife is saying and everything that she is like trying to be like, hey, this is what's going on, and you need to like accept that you've done this thing. And she doesn't even know what it is and still has the ability to tell him, hey, there's something you are holding on to that is keeping us in this dark place. And exactly what you're saying, I think that is a lot of women take on that role of having to be both a wife and a caretaker in a sense, especially when you have someone who is so blinded by their own goals and their own projection of what they think should be happening.
I took the one scene where he basically locks her in the house with him. That scene felt so symbolic of what happens to women who are essentially trapped in domestic situations with men that are pretty much abusive to them. And now I don't think that his abuse was straightforward. I think it was more mental abuse, ignoring her, talking over her,
Yeah.
shaming her. He shamed her quite a lot for holding on to her culture and doing things the way they've always done them. So I feel like being in a situation where they're in unfamiliar territory and he's trying to assimilate with or without her, it feels, except for he's also not letting her go. And that scene created that for me. Like, I
Yeah.
really hated him after that moment. I was like, oh, nope, this guy,
For
there is
those-
no turning back for me with this character.
For those of you that haven't seen His House, it is on Netflix. It's very
Mhm.
good. There's a lot of layers to His House. Without going into too many details, it's about two people that have immigrated from
Refugees.
refugees that have come from Sudan into England, and then dealing with the process of eventually becoming citizens and being treated as lesser than from the system in England, and then dealing with, let's just say, the haunting of their home. And so it's a lot about trauma, which is something that is mentioned a lot when I read about women in horror as writers, as directors, is the word trauma comes up a lot, and dealing with trauma through storytelling. And even though this film is written and directed by a man, but it has a lot of interesting themes about, as Justine was saying, about how women take on the role of being like the wife and the mother in a certain way. And even though there's a lot of experiences this character I will never understand because I can't, it's an experience I'll never have. She has these markings which are from certain experiences in her life, one of them being her family being brutally murdered. We don't see, this is something that she just talks about as a past event, very matter of factly, to a doctor. She's talking about and how some of the markings are protective, some of them are more about her history. And there's a line that she says that I do relate to, of course, in my own way, is that she says, I've survived by belonging nowhere.
Because she mentioned how there were two warring tribes, and the markings of one she had done on her body, and when her entire family was butchered, she took on the markings of the other one as well. And by having both, she belonged to neither, and that is how she survived, basically. And it's a really powerful scene because I think that the person that she was talking to, that doctor, was just making niceties. Oh, I like your necklace. Oh, those markings are really beautiful. She was just small talk niceties, and this woman is explaining these, like you said, trauma, that history of like her
In a
survival.
very matter-of-fact way, too.
Matter of factly, yeah. Like weather. Like we're talking about what we bought from Macy's last week. Like the way she talks about it like that is very jarring
Macy's,
for
we
this
are
character.
35, Justine. Macy's, we are a 35, not Jules, but like we are a 35.
I know what Macy's is.
I
What
was
is
trying to.
Child,
No, okay.
child.
That I picked Macy's because the lady she was talking to looks like she would shop at Macy's.
Excuse me. It's more like whatever English equivalent of LL Bean is what I saw.
Yeah.
Is this a clothing store? What is this?
It's like a department store in a mall.
Oh, different. Oh, okay.
Oh,
Okay.
I thought you were kidding at first, Crystal. I thought you're
No.
Canadian, so I forgot.
Yeah, I don't have that. I thought it was a grocery store. I was a
I
little
thought you were
confused.
saying like I'm so young. I don't know what Macy's is. It's like, oh,
No.
Canadian.
I missed it.
I think just a rebound, like definitely off of everything. I think there's so much complexity to this story, and like obviously it's kind of hard to watch it and not feel pain for the husband as well. And like even though he does something horrifically, to some degree unforgivable, it's still like
To survive.
Yes, it's survival. It's survival. And I think honestly that last scene, obviously spoiler unfortunately, that last scene where she kills the night witch.
That's how they explained her. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's from their own like
apologize.
lore, their lore from Sudan. It's called
Yeah.
the Night Witch.
And it's really, I've seen so many people say, like, I hated the design of the witch and everything, but I honestly felt like it was so, like, perfect for this particular movie. I think if it would have gone in a more intense, scary direction, then it would have totally taken away from the messaging that's happening. Because she's this pseudo daughter is coming forward, and she's taking that, and she is deciding to not let it go, but say, okay, this has happened. I acknowledge it's happened. And now I have to figure out how I'm going to move forward. And I think that truly she is his salvation. She is the person that pulls him from the trenches. And I think it speaks a lot to how just relationship dynamics in general really do, unfortunately, a lot of the weight of fixing relationships falls on women.
This is exactly where, in the point of the movie, like I said, where I realized, yep, this is definitely directed by a man. Because if I would have directed this movie, she would have watched him get taken. I would have been totally fine with it.
I feel like it was well written enough for me. For me, I felt it was well written enough, and that both characters, that even though he did things that, but especially the initial taking the girl on the bus. Little girl on the bus, the most egregious, less understandable, even though it is understandable in its own way. That I understand the choice she made, and so the way the ending happens is she is in a, it's not a cosmic space, but things happening, but it feels natural within the film, and she's sitting with a group of women from what seems like Sudan, where she's from. And she makes the decision to save him in the way she says, I'm going to go home now. And it's not like this great romantic gesture. It's more of like, you make a pairing with somebody. I think the characters were well written enough where I felt like I understood her choice, and I felt like it was realistic, and she wasn't. And she's making a choice to make a life with this person because she sees that he can eventually get there. Like,
Yeah,
as he
and
To
does.
me, I don't disagree with that. And I don't disagree with the ending. And I think that the characters were fleshed out enough. But like, to me, it shows what happens when a woman loses her community. And she had no
Oh,
community now. And she had a
but
community of women in Sudan. And she doesn't anymore. She just has him.
Do you
well,
think
that's
she
what
would
I
have made a
think.
different choice, guys, if things had been different for her and she had a stronger community of women in her earlier time, if there wasn't so much trauma and things happening with her in her home country?
I
Hard
think
to
it's a
say. That's a
really,
hard
Juliet.
question.
it's a very interesting point because I just think that I feel like maybe I have more empathy for him as someone who is my mom's first generation American, and like watching her trying to assimilate in so many different ways has been heartbreaking for me. And I've really tried hard to connect back to my culture because I felt so distant from it by those terms. And so I think that decision, while he has, and I think this goes into what the end of the movie is about, and while he has done these really horrific things, and like get to this last scene, it's like, yeah, and they're talking to Matt Smith, which by the way, I'm sorry, I can't read Matt Smith as a villain. He is a villain in so many movies, and I don't understand why. He just looks so soft to me.
He doesn't. I hated him. I wanted to punch him in the fucking face in that movie. Not in general.
Oh.
Like, seeing him in other roles or seeing him in an interview, he's fine. But in that movie, I'm like, fuck you, Matt Smith.
Oh, and
Fuck
Last
you.
Night in Soho? Are you kidding me? Every time he speaks, I'm like, get out of here.
I love him. I love him so much. I don't like his character in this movie. I thought
Oh.
he was too complicit.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
watched this film with my other half, who is cis white man from Sweden who immigrated here. So he has like a lot of privileges, but I did get a green card. And he felt a lot of this movie that I couldn't feel because I've been born here. It's a movie with a lot of layers and a lot of levels. And it's
Absolutely.
very much worth watching for anybody.
100%.
That's
Yeah,
definitely
I definitely sympathize with him on the assimilation side of things. Once he's there, the stuff I don't sympathize with him for is the way he steals a child.
Yeah, that's
I
hard.
don't
That's a
sympathize.
rough
I
one.
can't. That's hard for me to forgive as someone,
That's
as
the
a
way I think
mom.
we get to know him.
It's
first.
hard for me so bad.
Well-
Yeah, you do get to know him first, but his decisions after that, once you do know that and you like think back of all of the assimilation stuff, is so selfish. It's not just
do think it's a
because he
trauma
wants to
response,
assimilate.
too.
It is 100. Yeah, it's a trauma response.
standing
He
up
was
for
there,
anyone.
he
It's
stole a
just
fucking
like-
child and she drowned. Wipe away from saving this drowning child.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I don't forgive him.
I get it. No, I
would have
totally
let
get
him
it.
get
I
eaten
don't
by this
disagree.
night witch. But I do think that if she had a community of Sudanese women to congregate with and find support in, she would have let him get eaten by the night witch. She would have been fine. She would have been fine without him.
Do you
That's
feel
my
like
thought.
the Night Witch had a gender?
I think
I thought
no.
it was
The
So-
voice became
genderless.
deeper with time, but it felt, I don't know, I like to think of cosmic beings as like genderless. in a way.
androgynous or something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
They're fluid.
Sorry, I'm like
Yeah.
in terms of just like going back to his actions being totally unforgivable, which I obviously agree with. Like that seeing the mom as the bus is driving away getting shot down is honestly
I bawled.
heartbreaking scenes just ever.
Yeah.
But I think there is this interesting message of ghosts and what follows us in life and how we choose to live once we have understood that those ghosts are going to be there.
That
Mhm.
ending line where she explains that
Oh.
to Matt Smith's character is
It's
so
good.
haunting.
Krista, what did you feel about this movie?
I will admit I haven't rewatched it since it first came out, so I didn't get a rewatch in on this, but I loved it. I remember really liking this movie. Yeah, it was definitely hard hitting. It hit the feelers for sure. I need to rewatch it for sure.
I loved those cosmic aspects you guys talked about too, because those
Yeah.
cosmic aspects felt Lovecraftian at times. Like this night witch was this
At
like,
times, yeah.
oh, especially when there was like ocean scenes involved and like tentacles
Mhm.
coming
I
out
like
of the
to say
mouth. and-
cosmic
Yeah.
because like he didn't like totally invent it.
No,
I don't
No.
just say that to be a stickler and be the Meredith Brooks, I'm a bitch.
Oh, I like it. I'm trying to use the term cosmic more than Lovecraftian. 'Cause
Okay.
cosmic horror is some of my favorite, so I bring it up quite often. But Emma, you mentioned of the times. We talk about women in horror and how there needs to be more women in horror, and just generally, I feel like I'm always clamoring to find more women voices, women actors, women-led tropes, or women-led perspectives, women directed, women costumed, all of it. We love to support women here. But you looked into it, and women have been around behind the scenes in horror for a long time.
That is such a tasty lead-in. Anyway, this is a book that anybody that hasn't read it, I know that it's mirror. It says Women Make Horror. It's a
nice, perfect.
fantastic collection of different essays by different women about old and contemporary horror film. It's one of the things that kind of was a lead-in to me learning more so about the idea that women have always existed in horror films. So the opener to this book is that in around the 2010s, there's a lot of conversations of like, look at how many women are in horror, which there are, but they haven't not been there before, and that was good inspiration for the book itself. And I really love how there's a lot of details about not just in this book, but in general, that women have existed and marginalized groups in general. Anyone that's not a cis het white man, right? They always existed in pre and post production. And a lot of the times, auteur theory gets in the way of erasing people, like from movies and how they create. One we like to mention is someone that created one of our sexy characters, or at least Crystal and Justine's sexy characters. Phyllis St. Patrick created Gilman.
Gilman.
My favorite.
I love him.
But-
Wait, is he? He's on my socks.
Oh wow!
I love that.
I do this
What?
on my TikTok all the time now. Whenever someone mentions something on my like For You page and I happen to be wearing something of that, I like immediately stitch the video. I did that with my Dracula socks the other day. So go Gilman, we're here.
A specific Dracula or just general Dracula?
It's the Universal Monster socks.
That is
so-
such a nerd question. Jesus Christ. Who
It's
the
the
fuck
Bella.
asked
Well,
that?
Bella
Like, is it
Lugosi.
like Bella Lugosi or Christopher Lee or is it Gary Oldman or are we talking Max Shrek? Like what Dracula are we fucking talking about? Like it matters.
It's the Bella. The Bella.
The Bella.
Yeah, so
stupid.
Gilman, I'm super thirsty for. Gilman is like my favorite Universal monster, and the fact that Millicent Patrick created it,
Yes.
Well, there was a whole press kit for her specifically that Universal Monsters wanted to put out the woman behind the monster, and they took all these glamorous photos of her with the monster. It was all set to go, and I unfortunately cannot remember the name. Lucky for him, of the makeup effects artist that was part of
perfect.
the team.
perfect.
It's
He will not
is
live on
she-
in infamy.
It was Bud something. I can't remember his last name.
yeah, whatever. Fuck him.
Bud the
Not that he didn't
Spud.
do anything. It's
Bud.
he was more of the physical guy that created the monster effects, but she's the one that drew and designed the monster and the Gill Man. Let's not call him.
Do you think Millicent was a monster fedger?
I don't know.
Sure.
I don't know.
Oh.
I just what I do know is that
We talk a lot about those scenes totally meaning sex. She said those are
Yeah,
some
but that
sexy
wasn't
scenes.
so much her.
She talked about it a lot.
did?
Yeah, she talked about it a lot in her
Oh, I
interviews
didn't-
about
I
it.
didn't know that. Well, maybe good or I am.
Birds of a feather.
It's good.
Yeah.
Anyway, one of the head makeup effects artists who was he had a hissy fit about not getting enough attention and this whole press kit thing, so they canceled it all. And she not only did they cancel that, but she just didn't get credit for designing this creature who's so
Iconic.
iconic.
Yeah.
So until much later on, until very recently. And there's a lot of stories like that. And then there's Joan Harrison, who co-wrote a lot of Hitchcock's films, like Foreign
didn't know that.
Correspondent, Rebecca, which also was based on a book, but Suspicion, Saboteur. She also was a big TV producer, and she was also the producer for Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which went on for quite a while.
See,
Or we
Fun
think
facts with
about
Emma.
back to the auteur theory, and then I'll end it up because there's like so many examples I could pull. A big one that people talk about is Daria Nicolodi. She was heavily involved in a lot of Dario Argento productions and such, and she came up with a story. That's her mother or her grandmother's story, Suspiria, and then she's almost erased from that whole production and that in the way of creating the story and being such a big part of that story production and design. So those stories exist for women and marginalized groups, and we like to think intersectionally here. Throughout film history and storytelling history.
What was the first film that you guys recognized, like, oh, this was a woman, or really thought about the women involved in it when it came to horror?
Oh gosh.
Yeah, that's
okay.
question.
I feel like this maybe is not so like one of the first horror movies I ever remember watching as a kid was Hellraiser 2. And
oh my god, I have such a thing for Julia. I just want to say that. I would totally do anything for her, anything. I'm
that
not
part
kidding.
where she's wearing her skin and like Tiffany
Oh my
like
God,
grabs it. I
Chrissy's so
love it.
cool.
Oh, but I really like, it's so weird because even as a kid, I don't know how young I was, probably very young. I connected weirdly enough, very heavily to the Ringmouth Cenobite. Every time she'd pop up, I'd be like, "That's my girl. That's
my girl."
Yeah, the same connection. When I watched The Wizard of Oz, I was all about Wicked Witch of the West. She was my
hags,
girl.
right? You like them hags.
I fucking love my hags just naturally as a kid, just like drawn to that. I love Dorothy too. But I love
not as much as that witch, man.
not
I'm
as
with
much
you
as
on
that
that
witch,
one.
and not in a sexual way, just like little girl, like you could ruin my beautiful wickedness. A great line. And then I think of Julia from Hellraiser 2, where she's fairy tales change. I'm no longer the wicked stepmother, the wicked queen is what she says. And the thing is, Hellraiser 2 is such a good one to bring up, Jules, because I'm a big lover of Julia, especially in the second one, where she comes into her own. She's sexy even without skin. And powerful even without skin. But I love Christy though, wearing her.
Yes.
Oh my god, they're both such great female characters.
Kirsty was such a good character from the beginning. She is one of the most underrated final girls out there.
I don't consider her a final girl, so this is where I become a film bro.
I'm so glad. Let's talk about this because this is so cool to me to talk about how people consider a final girl versus a hero versus a whatever you want to call it. But there's a lot of lines that people draw on these things, and I feel like nobody is the same with it. Me, if they survived at the end and they're a girl or a woman, I'm like, they're a final girl. But I understand, like, there is also some more weight to some of these characters when you can tell, like, at a certain time period, that could have easily been written for a man. In Ripley's case, where it was written as a man and then played by a woman and completely changed. Yeah, so that's not a final girl, is it? Because it was never intended to be a girl. She is the protagonist. She is the hero. Mm-hmm. And I love that. And I like that distinction. And I'm starting to embrace it more now.
So does it almost feel like final girls are like helpless to some degree, like they don't really have enough agency? So let's say Sally in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, she really just runs and gets away. She doesn't actually survive versus someone like, I would say a favorite example is Samara Weaving in Ready or Not, just absolutely kicking ass the entire time.
Surviving. I feel like the agency distinction is whether they got themselves into the mess or not, and whether it was by their choices or makings.
Is part of the final girl process is experiencing the loss and trauma of everyone around you, as well as surviving. So much more.
So why isn't Kirsty a final girl to you?
Because this is where I'm the film room. Because Hellraiser's not a slasher. But then the weird thing is, fucked up stupid thing about me is, which also makes part of the film bro thing.
Nightmare on Elm Street is also not a slasher?
Yeah, it is. Shut up. Anyway.
Shut up.
Explain.
Bro, this is where I become the hypocrite, okay?
Okay.
I don't consider a Texas Chainsaw exactly a slasher. I think it's slasher adjacent. But I consider Sally a final girl. So what the fuck does that mean? So you think
final girls only belong in slasher subgenre, or?
Yes and no.
Because to me, I always thought that the final girl was someone who went through the shit and survived, no matter whether it's a slasher or not. And you're right, maybe that is what it's become. I think that's what's so cool about some of the horror genre
there's
in
actresses,
general.
I'm sorry, I'm totally interrupting you. But then there's actresses like Barbara Crampton who hate that term.
I don't care about that, to be honest. It bothers
No,
me.
she says
It
it's
triggers
sexist
me with the
because
whole
if she's like, I was
dangerous
a male
bullshit.
actor, they
So
wouldn't call it anything specific.
I
Wow.
wonder if maybe the term.
that's why I don't embrace the final boy term.
Maybe,
I don't
like,
like
I
that
love
term.
no,
the term in
I
general
love the
is
final boy
flawed.
term.
No,
I
you have
love
your
it.
own shit. You just survived. Congratulations, dude.
No, you okay? Justine, you need to watch Scream Queen. Like immediately, you need to
know,
watch
I
Scream
know.
immediately.
I
In
will
terms of-
watch it, but I'm not going to embrace Final Boy.
No, you might know. There's so much to it, which is like deviating so much away. Have you seen Scream Queen, Crystal or Jewel?
I don't think I have.
Okay, everybody immediately. All right, immediately.
All right, I guess we'll talk to you
Okay,
guys
well,
later.
this isn't about boys, okay? This is about
No,
women.
wait, fine, a little bit, because it's not so
Alright.
much. It's not so much about men as it is about all things that are very specifically gendered when they don't need to be. In the sense that it's a documentary that is framed as about the actor who's in Nightmare on Elm Street 2 and how he was gay and he felt very outed by how gay coded that film was. And then, but a lot of the conversation also is about how people reacted to it in a way that was subconscious, as they weren't ready to see a man in such a vulnerable position or in a feminine position. And then I think back to interviews of Bruce Campbell saying that Sam Raimi, and this is not me damning Bruce Campbell or Sam Raimi. This is just like me just connecting things together, not making any judgments. But Sam Raimi to make
Me
in
too.
the first Evil Dead film, because Ash was supposed to be just your everyday person. Like he's not supposed to be your hero. He's not supposed to be anything specific. He's just supposed to be an everyday guy. Sam Raimi said, and this is how he said it, is I want you to scream like a girl. Scream like a girl. And I don't that he said it that way, but it connects to Scream Queen, and I think it's a great documentary, not only about that actor's journey, but also about the idea of how we over gender things sometimes. Of like, why does it have to be specifically male or female? Can't that just be a person's experience?
I feel like
Yeah.
that goes back to
To
the term of final girl. Term final girl, I feel like is inherently flawed because I feel like we're going to see women as being vulnerable victims regardless of what position they're in to some degree because we've been so socialized to do that. And I almost feel like sometimes it's so hard to watch the classic slashers because you have these women that are really damsel in distress characters who are only running, and it's not to say that's not a response to trauma because it absolutely is. And I totally understand that is.
I can't say that I do better.
Yeah,
As a
exactly.
person like randomly experiencing violence when you don't expect it.
So I think to some degree representation and acknowledging where gender gaps exist is important, and it is important to have some gendered things. The final girl trope and tropes in general in horror evolve and change so much because a majority of it is steeped in fantasy, like fiction, and that makes it that allows so much of us to be creative with it and impart our own feelings and interpretations from it. And it's just like the zombie. What's a zombie versus what's a final girl? Like these are all things that have changed over time as we've developed characters and have, I think, read into horror more, and the fandom has grown because now we have way more thoughts and perspectives being put out there and interpretations being accepted. And I think that that's super important. It's important. I think it's important to understand that what the final girl trope started as isn't necessarily what people are talking about nowadays. And maybe it has become more generalized, sure. Or maybe it's the same for maybe Emma, you are very specific about your final girl trope. That's fine.
No, so
I love to hear it. I think it's so cool to talk about.
I think me being specific about it, it's not something like I hold true to. And someone like recently I talked about, I can't even remember. I talked about Nancy recently being my favorite final girl, and some people mentioned Kirsty or someone mentioned Samara, which is like characters that I don't consider final girls, but I actually really don't care. And no, there's no harm in considering certain characters final girls, so I'm not gonna like correct everybody because
just
it's a me thing. Just you.
I love it.
It doesn't matter. There's certain things
It doesn't.
that's I think that some horror fans have that some others don't, is that does it matter?
Sometimes
It doesn't.
yeah.
And
Here's where it does
becomes-
matter, Emma.
it
Like
depends
real quick.
on-
It matters to me why a person is imparting their like black and white information on you. Their motives for why a final girl is specifically how they think a final girl is and nobody else is right. That matters because to me, that is where you're getting steeped in misogyny because now they're saying, nope, final girls can't be smart. They can't have skills. They can't have been like heroes. They can't, like, Ripley's not a final girl because she was trained. She was like, yada, yada, yada. She went back. She's not a
She went
final
back,
girl.
save the cat. She's a hero.
Yeah, and then it's like you bring up Sydney Prescott and you're like, is Sydney Prescott a hero? Because by the end of Scream, she's shooting them. Like she is attacking them. And by the second, third, fourth one, fifth one now, she's going into danger. She is trying to
Well,
stop.
like
She's
Laurie
an active
Strode.
participant.
Yeah.
I know that you're not a big Jamie Lee fan, Justine, but that's what the Laurie Strode characters become.
It is. It's the same. It's that same journey. And so, do you consider a final girl just in the first film of that franchise when you're using those kind of ideas that like a final girl has to be someone who was just tortured and made it through? Is that the bare bones definition of a final girl? But then there's no consistency when you hear people talk about what they say. Like, if I were to say, my definition of a final girl is they have to be a victim and just survive. That's a final girl. And then you ask them to list them and you're like, none of those fit your definition. Like every single time. So sometimes it matters because I feel like it's allowing this idea to like fester in the comment sections of TikToks that I don't like. I don't want to see it. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Where like it's frustrating. And I don't know, maybe I'm just an asshole and want to be like, let's hear it. Let's hear your definition of what it is. But if you tell me mine's wrong, that's the end of the
There's definitely
discussion.
a certain approach I see, and it doesn't matter who the person is. There's just a certain conversations are hard to have on social media of any kind, but there is definitely a way to approach it saying, oh, I see what you mean there, but I always saw it as is different than actually it's an attitude. There's a certain attitude. Sometimes it can be misread. I'm not saying that it can be misread because I know that I am often on the defensive more often than I need to be because I'm used to having to be. But then again,
it's hard to exist as a woman in the horror community. Like literally you could say anything and someone's going to find something wrong about it. And we don't get the same comments that men in the community do. I've had multiple comments about my appearance, which I thought was wild to me because I'm like, I talk about something that has nothing to do with my appearance.
What does it have to, you're talking about movies. What does it have to do with you personally at all?
And then someone, this is maybe just like a personal thing, but someone was like, you look like A.D. Bryant. And I was like, I most certainly don't. We're just like both fat and moderately funny. I love A.D. Bryant, don't get me wrong, but it was just like such a total, like don't say that.
It's a weird that reminds me of like when Ginger Snap's beloved horror film was when they put the press release out, and that is definitely a project between John Fassett and Karen Walton, but there was a lot of flack about it because it's 1999, back in 1999, partying, but not Columbine, and then the shootings in Alberta had happened, and so there was a lot of more controversy about violence in movies about teens, but Karen Walton was the one that suffered all of the flack. And not John at all, instead of both of them, who are both equally involved in the creation of the story told in this way. It happens to women a lot. Like Anna Biller, people will be like, The Love Witch is a feminist movie. And she's like, not really. I didn't mean it to be a feminist movie. Just because women talk to each other doesn't mean it's a feminist movie. I just wanted to make a movie that was a stylistic interpretation of a lot of films I loved. So there's a certain expectation for women with that.
It's interesting because I feel like something like Jennifer's Body, which came out a couple years later and has a lot of the same themes and a lot of the same storyline, was so heavily attacked in so many different ways. And that's both a female writer and director. And I wonder if the male directing of Ginger Snaps shielded it critically because it's definitely critically more well received than Jennifer's Body.
I feel like that was a reception and marketing issue.
Time.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
More than anything,
it took a little more time for Ginger Snaps to be received. It's also Canadian. Jennifer's Body too. when upon initial release, Body was, as you guys all know, was marketed towards young men when it wasn't made for them. And Ginger Snaps didn't have that problem, but it was Canadian, Crystal. But it wasn't marketed towards the young women. So I think that Ginger Snaps didn't have the problem of being marketed towards young men more so than it should have been, as much as Jennifer's Body did.
Yeah.
I can imagine that if they had cast anybody other than Megan Fox in Jennifer's Body, the marketing would have been different.
There's two girls that like
And-
kiss for a second in it. So we're
Because
going
of
against
who Megan Fox was at the time and
At that
her
time, yeah.
popularity and
Yeah.
who if you're a studio exec with no fucking understanding of anything other than what is happening in your bubble and you're Megan Fox is in a movie, you're gonna, we'll market this to boys. She's hot.
Yeah.
Obviously. I wonder if they had any unknown lead actress at the time who was just as equally hot, sure, in that role, who was not as well known as Megan Fox for her roles and what Michael Bay fucking did to her. And perhaps that movie would have been marketed differently, or they would have listened, or not marketed at all, actually. It probably would have been a very limited release type film because it would have been for women. And obviously we don't go to the movies. So
Obviously.
something that AIP had in their production release throughout, I don't know, the 50s into the 70s is like they know their main target as especially exploitation filmmakers in different degrees. Yeah. They're like, we know teenage boys are going to come to see our movies. That's the movies we're going to make. Make movies
when it's really teenage girls, to be honest.
I was just going back off of Emma's point in terms of auteur theory and women behind the scenes. To me, Jennifer's Body should have been marketed as Oscar-winning writer coming off of an Oscar win who wrote this movie, and it is fantastically written. Diablo Cody is one of my favorite writers of all time.
At the same time, too.
Exactly. And I've seen so much heavy criticism, not only of Jennifer's Body, but also of Juno, which I think is wild because I think it's both of those movies have held up incredibly well in terms of course there's some humor in there that is not super socially conscious, but I think it's intentional. I think it's like these are small town people.
They're almost caricatures of people.
Oh, absolutely.
The racist joke towards the janitor in the beginning of Jennifer's Body, I've seen criticism about that. But again, I don't
think it's fair for sure. I think some of that criticism is fair, but I think a lot of it also, there are movies that I don't think that same criticism gets put up against
100%. Thank
you. Male writers. Absolutely.
Like 100%. Yeah. There are so many movies that do not age well that we all still tout and love. Idle Hands, I talk about and watch every single fucking Halloween. And none of that movie holds up today. None of it.
And I don't think there's one trauma movie that doesn't have at least 5 very racist jokes.
Y'all know I do that series about the Tubi best of the worst, and
I just watched Killer Donuts.
Every single one of those movies just filled with like horrific humor. And sometimes I feel like the thing is, it's not whether we're watching or supporting or whatever, it's acknowledge that this stuff is maybe not the best. And still, I think you can still love something and still acknowledge that, hey, it's probably
we
not
talk about
the
that
greatest
a lot.
Yeah.
I think we mentioned that every podcast. We mention how it's okay to love something as long as you acknowledge that it's problematic now and that things have changed. These are time capsules. That's the point of art.
Yeah.
Karen Kusama,
Anna Lily Amirpour,
Lee Janiak,
Kate Siegel, Mimi Cave.
Oh, until next time. Bye bye.